He was born into a time when people arrived in the world under circumstances they had no say in, when lives were shaped more by oppressive laws than by personal desire. Among the many children torn from their families and raised in fields and plantations, there was a young man of African descent living in the province of Sao in the 19th century. His story did not begin with a miracle, but with the harsh simplicity shared by thousands like him. A child taken away, growing up in labor, never asked about his dreams, given just enough to survive. Yet as the years passed, it became clear that something about him was different. Not because of some myth surrounding his birth or any fantastical claim, but because his body grew stronger in a striking way, like what happens to some people through nothing more than heredity and relentless work. He grew up in a brutal society. He woke before dawn and returned after sunset, hauling sacks of crops, pushing heavy carts, performing tasks that required unusual strength. Over time, overseers noticed that his physical ability surpassed that of most men. No one called him a hero, and he was not raised in an environment that allowed him to understand himself. Yet he drew attention even when he tried to remain ordinary. His muscles formed clearly through daily labor, through sweat, through endless effort, and rather than praise. This simply meant more was demanded of him. Saum at that time was facing a quiet struggle. The upper classes sought greater control, while the oppressed searched for any opening to breathe. Meanwhile, the world was slowly moving toward the abolition of slavery, though some regions refused to accept the change. Amid this tension, the young man's name began to spread among nearby farms, not because of fame, but through the whispered words of workers. He can carry what 3 men need to carry. He dragged a tree trunk alone. We've never heard him complain despite the exhaustion. People clung to the simplest signs of hope, and so they attached themselves to his story. They did not see him as a legend, but as a symbol of endurance in a world that tried relentlessly to crush them. As he grew stronger and older, groups organizing primitive strength competitions heard about him. These events were nothing like modern sports. They were shows where owners exploited the power of men to draw spectators. When an overseer came to offer him a place in such competitions, he had no ability to refuse. The decision wasn't his, and participation was a way to avoid punishment. He entered the arena for the first time without knowing what awaited him. The place was simple, a dirt clearing, a few ropes, and several strong men known in the region. They looked at him with curiosity, some with mockery, others with quiet fear. They assumed he was merely a well-built laborer, and he himself knew nothing about shows or combat. He wasn't there to become a champion. He was forced into it. When the first contest began, he did not aim to win. He simply moved as he did in the fields. with natural heaviness and a strength he did not fully understand. A strength that was simply part of him. His opponent fell quickly, not because he attacked fiercely, but because the difference in strength was obvious. The matches continued, one after another, the crowd growing more astonished each time, and the overseers more greedy. Soon, his name spread beyond Sao. Newspapers rarely cared about enslaved lives, but stories traveled faster than printed pages. With time, he found himself in a position he had not chosen, people cheering for him without him knowing why, opponents fearing him, overseers trying to exploit him. He did not enjoy fighting, but he lacked the luxury of refusal. He saw how others were treated, how he was viewed as someone without a voice or a future. Yet something inside him rejected humiliation, not a physical trait, but a deep feeling that he deserved a better life. One day, after a difficult match he had been forced to join despite his exhaustion, he sat outside the arena and looked at his hands. He did not see them as symbols of strength, but as symbols of years of labor, back pain, and the invisible chains that bind souls before they bind bodies. For the first time, he felt he wanted to leave this path, though he knew it was nearly impossible. Still, little by little, others began to see him differently. He was no longer just a strong man. He became a symbol for some workers who saw in him a reflection of hope. If he can stand after all he's been through, they said, then we can stand too. That thought comforted him. His life, which once felt meaningless, now seemed to have an effect on others. As abolition approached, much changed in the region. Some landowners fled, others sold their property, and some tried to appear benevolent. The young man sought his own path away from what had been forced upon him. He left the competitions, left the farms, and began working for wages in ports and workshops, attempting to live as a normal human being rather than a spectacle. It was not easy. People recognized him, tried to bring him back, threatened him or tempted him. But he moved from place to place, helping those in need, working quietly, refusing to return to the life that had stolen so many years. He did not seek glory, only peace, and the chance to be part of life rather than a display for others. Time passed, and no one knew where he went or how he lived his final years. Some claimed he settled in a small village as a simple laborer. Some said he traveled with sailors. Others insisted he disappeared into the forests, searching for a new life. But what remained was not his body, nor his matches, but his impact on those who saw him stand despite every hardship. He was not a legend, but a man who lived as he did because of his era, leaving behind a story told to this day, not because it is full of marvels, but because it is the story of a real human being who endured, suffered, and chose to continue in his own way. in the small port where he later worked. The laborers recognized him immediately by his broad shoulders and striking calmness. He never told them anything about his past, and they never asked. He arrived before everyone else, arranged the heavy ropes, dragged crates, balanced cargo on carts, as if trying to use his strength to repair what had been broken inside him by years of exploitation. Each morning he looked out over the sea as though it were a clean page he refused to stain with memories of dusty arenas and forced fights. He lived in a small wooden room near the pier, containing nothing but a straw bed, a water basin, and 3 pieces of clothing. He owned only what he could carry in his hand, perhaps because life had taught him not to become attached to things. Yet workers sometimes saw him sitting by the pier in the evenings, staring at the horizon for a long time, as if searching for a meaning he had not yet reached. He rarely spoke, but he helped everyone without being asked. If a man struggled to lift a crate, he approached quietly. If someone was injured, he was the first to check on him. Perhaps this was his way of healing himself before helping others. One evening, a new employee from the city arrived at the port. He was an educated young man, familiar with newspapers and stories from larger towns. When he saw the large, quiet laborer, he recalled the tales he had heard. He approached him and asked softly, so others would not hear, "Are you him?" The man did not raise his eyes from the rope he was tying. He simply said, "I'm a worker like anyone else." The young man was not convinced, but he did not insist. Over the following days, he watched him occasionally, not only out of curiosity, but to understand the difference between rumors and reality. One quiet night, he sat beside him by the sea and asked with genuine respect, "Have you ever regretted anything?" The man paused before answering. The question was heavier than it appeared. Then he said quietly, "Regret requires time. I spent my whole life trying to survive, not thinking." He fell silent for a moment, then added, "But I regret one thing, that I never learned how to live for myself before I was forced to live for others." Those words were enough for the young man to understand that the person before him was not a mythical figure, but a human being who had lived many years under merciless laws. From that night on, he spoke with him more often, not to write a story, but to understand how it felt to live a life with so few choices. The man told him short sentences with few details, as though he did not want to revisit those years. Yet he allowed the young man into his inner world because he sensed no exploitation or cheap curiosity. Months passed, and the port's activity slowed. Trade changed, ships dwindled, and many workers left for other places. The strong laborer remained, working every day, helping everyone, then sitting in the evenings by the sea. But inside him, something began to shift. The idea of leaving grew stronger, not as an escape, but as a search for the final chapter of his life, one he could live on his own terms. One night, during strong winds, a captain arrived at the port, seeking men to join him on a long voyage to distant southern regions. He needed men accustomed to hard work. When he saw the large laborer, he paused, then said, "I've heard you don't back down from work. Would you like to come?" The man did not answer immediately. He looked at the restless sea, then at the ropes and wooden ships, as if the entire scene reminded him that his life was not tied to one place. After a long silence, he said, "I'll need a day to think." The captain did not know that this day would be one of the heaviest in the man's life. He spent the night thinking, should he stay in the place he had finally become used to, or leave as he had done so many times? Should he start again, or remain with what he had built? At sunrise, he made his decision quietly. It was not a decision to run away, nor to seek adventure, but a simple choice to live the rest of his life in a place where no one knew him, where no one would demand that he be more than he was. He found the captain waiting for him at the pier. He said steadily, "I will go with you." On his last day at the port, workers gathered around him, some thanking him, others silently saddened. His presence had been a source of reassurance, not because he was strong, but because he was always there when needed. When he picked up his small bag, he carried nothing from the past except the memory he left in those who knew him. He boarded the ship and stood on deck, watching the city fade behind him. He did not know where he would end up or what awaited him. But for the first time in many years, he felt he was choosing his own path. As the ship moved away, the port became a tiny point, then disappeared. After that day, news of him became unclear. Some said he settled in a quiet coastal village and worked with fishermen. Others said he became a captain's assistant, raising sails and repairing wood. Some claimed he died at sea, in silence like his final years. But those who truly knew him said something else. He had never sought glory or story. He sought a life where he had the right to simply be human, not a force to be displayed or used. And that is why his memory remained, not as a mythical hero, but as a man whose quiet endurance changed those around him. When he returned to the ship that night, he lay on his bunk, staring at the wooden ceiling above him, listening to the creaking of the hull as the tide shifted. The familiar sounds that once comforted him now felt like chains pulling him back to a life of drifting. He closed his eyes, but sleep refused to come. Every time he drifted toward rest, the same image appeared: the child hammering the small nail, the villagers laughing around the fire, the quiet look the woman had given him on the shore. By dawn, his decision had not become clearer, only heavier. The crew began preparing for departure. Barrels were loaded, Ropes tightened, sails checked. The sounds of departure echoed across the quiet bay. He stood on the deck, watching the island slowly come alive with morning light. Smoke rose from small cooking fires. Fishermen pushed their boats into the water. Voices called out greetings across the shore. He felt something inside him pulling toward that land, as though a part of him had remained there overnight. The captain approached him, stopping beside him without speaking at first. "You're troubled," the captain finally said. He did not deny it. The captain studied his face, then spoke quietly, as if offering a rare truth. "Some men are made for the sea. Others only used it to survive until they found a place to land." The man swallowed, feeling his chest tighten. "And which do you think I am?" he asked. The captain gave a small, knowing smile. "I think you already know." The crew shouted that they were ready to raise the anchor. The captain turned to walk away. But before he did, he placed a hand on the man's arm and added, "If you choose to stay, you owe no explanation, not to me, not to anyone." The man watched him leave, then looked again toward the island. He saw the same woman from the day before standing near the shore, a basket in her arms. She wasn't waving or calling out. She simply stood there watching the ship, her expression unreadable but steady. It was not invitation nor expectation, only acknowledgement. Something in that quiet presence struck him more deeply than any word could. The anchor lifted, the sails filled. The ship began to drift slowly away from the shore. His breath grew shallow. Every step the ship took away from the island felt like a thread tightening painfully inside him. He tried to tell himself that he had survived worse separations, that the sea had always been his refuge, that leaving was what he knew. But this time, the weight was different. Halfway out of the bay, he suddenly moved. He grabbed his small bag, slung it over his shoulder, and walked toward the railing. A few sailors turned to look, confused. One shouted after him, "What are you doing?" He didn't answer. For the first time in years, his movements were not driven by orders or necessity, but by choice. He climbed the railing, paused for the briefest moment as the wind whipped around him, then leapt. The cold water closed over him like a shock of rebirth. He surfaced, gasping, and began swimming hard toward the shore. The sailors shouted. Ropes were thrown. Someone called for a boat, but the captain raised his hand and stopped them. "Let him go," the captain said. The swim was long and difficult, but every stroke felt purposeful. When he finally reached the shallows, he stood, water streaming from his clothes, chest burning with exhaustion and exhilaration. The villagers had gathered, watching silently. The woman with the basket stepped forward, looking at him with calm eyes, She did not look surprised. "You came back," she said. He nodded, breathing heavily. "I think I need to stop running." She studied him for a moment, then simply said, "Then come." She turned and began walking toward the village. He followed, feeling the sand beneath his feet, the warmth of the rising sun on his back, and for the first time in his life, the sensation that the path ahead was his own, behind him. The ship continued its journey, becoming smaller and smaller on the horizon. He did not look back. "If you want, I can continue with a long section showing how he begins integrating into the village, his relationship with the woman and the community, the emotional struggle of building a new identity, a new conflict that tests his decision. No one asked where he came from or why he had jumped from the ship. Island life had taught its people that every traveler carried a story, and that some stories needed silence more than questions. The elders offered him a small abandoned hut near the edge of the trees, nothing more than wooden walls and a thatched roof, but sturdy enough to live in. He thanked them with a quiet nod and immediately set to work repairing it. He replaced broken planks, reinforced the beams, filled gaps with woven palm leaves. By evening, the hut looked lived in again. Several villagers watched him work, impressed by his strength and skill, though he barely noticed their presence. When night fell, he sat outside on a small log, listening to the soft rhythm of waves in the distance. The air smelled of salt and earth, and for the first time in many years, the silence around him felt peaceful rather than threatening. Yet inside him, a different kind of storm brewed. Choosing to stay had been an act of courage or desperation, but now that the decision was real, fear crept in. He had spent so long surviving that the idea of belonging felt fragile, almost dangerous. What if he failed? What if he could not adapt? What if the past followed him here? As he stared at the dark horizon, he realized that the hardest battles were no longer physical. The following days settled into a rhythm. At dawn, he accompanied the fishermen, helping them push their boats into the water. He learned to mend nets, to read currents, to recognize when the wind would shift. His strength was invaluable, but the villagers valued something else even more: his willingness to work alongside them without pride or complaint. The children adored him. They followed him around, asking him to lift heavy stones or carve small wooden toys. At first he felt awkward, but gradually, their laughter chipped away at the hard shell he had built around himself. One morning, while he was repairing a fishing net, the woman with the basket approached him, up close. She seemed even more anchored than he remembered, her posture steady, movements deliberate, her eyes sharp and observant. "You work as if you've always been here," she said. He glanced at her, unsure how to respond. Compliments unsettled him. I work because I don't know how to be idle. She smiled faintly. Most who come here rest first. You build. He looked down at the net in his hands. If I stop moving, I start thinking. She didn't laugh. Instead, she sat beside him, picking up a torn section of the net. Then think while your hands move, she said. They worked side by side in silence. It was not an uncomfortable silence, but one filled with unspoken understanding. When they finished, she stood and said, "We fish tomorrow. Come with us." It was not a request. It was an invitation into the life of the village. He nodded. The sea was calm the next morning. He rowed in the woman's boat with 2 others, watching how she guided it with practiced confidence. She handled the oars with strength and grace, her eyes scanning the water with instinct born of years. When the nets were cast, they waited. The sun rose higher, painting the surface with gold. He felt strangely content, surrounded by simple purpose and honest work. After hours, they hauled the nets in, heavy and alive with shimmering movement. One of the ropes slipped, and instinctively he grabbed it, pulling with a force that astonished the others. The boat tilted dangerously, but he held steady until the weight balanced. The woman breathed out, half surprised, half amused. You could pull the island itself closer if you wanted. He shook his head. Strength has caused me more trouble than good. She studied him carefully. Strength is not the problem. How it is used is. Her words struck him deeply,